Mark. Yeah, we're getting started in just a minute. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Um, Today we have a lot to kind of go over. There's been a lot of changes to dependency tracks since since version 3.0 came out early 2018. 3.0 was in development starting, I guess, 2017, and it was finally released in early, I think it was like March 2018, something like that. Um, but there has been a number of advancements in 3.0 that I think as a community we should all be proud of, um, because realistically I think we've actually proven that this type of tool is not only valuable, but kind of like leading the way in terms of creating a market for it, which is pretty unique. So there's a lot to go over with 4.0. So let me got way too many windows open here. Let me try to share. Let's see. This is what I want to share. Yes, right here. Okay, so really the goals for version 3 were kind of, well, not overly well defined, right? We were essentially leading some great unknowns. It was version 3.0 was truly the great experiment to see whether or not this type of tool and the approach that we were taking were viable or not, because nobody had really done this before. One of the first things that we had to address is to determine whether or not SBOMs could be an alternative to software composition and analysis, or SCA. Um, and they are. And from observation, I think the majority of adopters of dependency track use it as an SCA alternative. So they're doing SCA-like things. They're just not actually using an SCA tool to do it. So they're not doing the binary analysis. They're not doing the manifest analysis. They're doing SBOMs instead, which is an alternative in this approach. But we also had to answer the question, can SBOMs coexist and also complement SCA? There's a lot of value in SCA, especially for binary analysis when you don't necessarily know what you have, right? Maybe you're given a bunch of stuff from who knows where, and you have no idea what's in it. So there's obviously still a lot of value in SCA, but I think especially in 2019, where we saw SCA vendors, plural, start adopting SBOMs, right, as something else that they do, along with some market research firms actually pointing out the fact that SBOMs will be or should be adopted by all SCA solutions in the market, if they want to be viable in the future. I think does give credence to the fact that yes, they can coexist, and yes, they are complementary for those use cases. So we've actually proven that, though, and it's quite humbling. Um, One of the other questions, there's four questions that essentially we had for 3.0. Um, Continuous visibility. Can this be realized? Meaning that given all these SBOMs, whether they are first-party SBOMs, whether they are things that I've acquired from suppliers, can we know what's affected and where are they affected, right? That's a famous infamous thing, I guess now that Josh Corman refers to is, what is affected and where am I affected? And Dependency Track 3.0 and that data model for 3.x actually proved that yes, we can do this, right? We can actually surface the visibility of all of your first-party risk, all of your third-party risk, so we'll actually know what components in your organization are affected and what assets or what applications those vulnerable components are affected by. So all of this is completely realized in 3.x today. The fourth question that we had to figure out if this was going to be a thing or not is whether or not continuous transparency can be achieved or not. Continuous transparency is definitely not um, for the starters. Just going down this journey. Continuous transparency is really about, can I share the SBOMs that I am producing myself or ingesting from other sources? Can I ingest these with, or can I share this information with other business units within my same organization? Can I transparently and automatically share this information with my suppliers and my customers and my partners? Not for everybody, obviously, but as I've always said, the radius of transparency, I'm sorry, transparency is really a radius, and it's really up to the organization to define whether or not and how far that radius expands out, right? Do you want to be open and honest with yourselves as an organization? Do you want to keep on growing that out so that you are more and more and more transparent with various people in your supply chain? And we've actually proven that while continuous transparency can be achieved, and it is being achieved today, um, it's not something that the majority of organizations are ready for. But that was a question we had to ask, right? So what are the goals for 4.0 or 4.x, the entire 4.x series? Can SBOM provide insight? Cannot. I think so. But we need to be able to figure out in Dependency-Track how that's actually going to surface, right? What kind of, we already know that SBOM can describe things that SCA cannot discover, but how do you implement that, right? How do you surface that type of visibility and the associated risk to what it is that you're providing insight for? So that's going to be kind of an ongoing theme for version 4.x. Another thing that, again, 4 questions for 4.x. Can deeper supply chain risk be identified? Right now, Dependency-Track, which is essentially why that most organizations that use it as an SCA alternative, is that it kind of does SCA-like things, right? It does known vulnerabilities. It does outdated component analysis. It does license compliance. Great, that sounds like an SCA tool. But can we go deeper, right? Can we go deeper into the supply chain to figure out other forms of risk? I think the answer is yes. But again, 4.x is going to be kind of an experiment to figure out how far down the rabbit holes, plural, we can go and still remain a viable open source project without, commercial stuff. Can policy enforcement be enforced? Can policy be enforced on the supply chain itself? That's an interesting question. If you look at a lot of tools today, it's really about local enforcement, right? My organization has a policy. Okay, great. No Apache struts, no, old versions of OpenSSL. Okay, great. That's in my policy. Now what? How can you enforce that not just for your organization, but across your supply chain? So that's kind of an experiment that I'd like to see, worked on in version 4.x. So I think we answered, to summarize, we answered yes to all of the questions for 3.x. And the questions for 4.x are kind of uncertain, right? Which is why we're going down this path. Um, the fourth question for 4.x is how far can it scale, right? Right now, it's it's used by a lot of organizations. There's tens of thousands of organizations using Dependency-Track today, which is fantastic, right? But how many projects are you building, right? I've seen upwards of over 1,000 projects being analyzed by an organization in Dependency-Track, which is great, right? First-party code, 1,000 projects. That's a lot of components. That's a lot of uh, different types of analysis being performed. Um, but that's just 1,000. A typical enterprise is going to have tens of thousands of applications, whether it's first party, third party, vendor supplied, whatever. They're going to have a lot more than 1,000. So how can we scale Dependency-Track to be able to support hundreds of thousands of projects? So that's going to be another thing that we're going to be experimenting with version 4 or 4.x series. So let's break those 4 questions down a little bit. Can SBOM provide the insight that SCA alone cannot? One of the 4 of the things that I would love to be able to achieve in the 4.x series is really analyzing pedigree and provenance, right? Um, SCA tools can analyze, in some cases, provenance, right? Where something came from. SCA tools can very limitedly determine whether or not something was modified or not. That's also on the roadmap for 4.x series. Um, but open source is the ultimate supply chain, and organizations can and will fork things and create their own versions of those things. Happens continuously. So how do we identify that, and how do we present that in the user interface, and how do we also start analyzing that for various forms of risk that SCA can't even begin to identify? So this is really looking at not only is it modified or not, but what those modifications were. What did I change and why? And who made those changes and when? So that's really some objectives I'd like to see come to fruition in 4.x. Um, Looking at supplier risk, you can think of this as suppliers being open source projects. Every open source project, including Dependency-Track, is a supplier. But you can also include commercial entities as suppliers as well, and being able to identify the risk of those. So I would love to kind of experiment with how do we make that happen, and again, using SBOMs to achieve this. So that's going to be interesting. I'm going to have a lot of fun with that, I think. Identifying services. CycloneDX for the past, well, since about March when version 1.2 was released, supports services. So CycloneDX can describe not only the components and their dependency relationships, but the services that you rely on as well. So if I'm relying on some REST APIs, I can describe those in my SBOM. SCA tools don't even begin to be able to achieve that today. But SBOMs, it's very easy to do. You can describe all the endpoints and the data classifications and the flow, the direction of the data, whether or not it crosses trust boundaries or not, whether or not authentication is required or not. So there's a lot of things that you can describe in terms of services today. I would love to be able to visualize that, and once it's visualized, once it's identified, then start to eventually perform various forms of analysis on that. So that's going to be that's actually coming in. I think it's scheduled for version 4.2, if memory serves. So that's gonna be a lot of fun. I'm gonna really enjoy including services into Dependency-Track in a future version. But also, I would love to be able to do full stack dependencies. So right now there's a ticket open in Dependency-Track to be able to support the dependency graphs, which CycloneDX can obviously do, but it's just not visualized in Dependency-Track today. One of the reasons why it's not visualized is because of the existing data model and the constraints that we had from that. It's really limited us from what we could do. So with 4.x, we'll see why we're able to do that in the future. But dependency relationships between software components, that's easy, right? But I would love to do full stack dependency relationships. And what I mean by that, I mean that, you know, this application, all these libraries and their dependency relationships. But I would also like to describe things like, well, this kernel, this Linux kernel version that I'm using and have defined in my SBOM has a dependency on, I don't know, the Apple M1 chip, because CycloneDX also does hardware. So why not include, that full stack dependency relationship and, in our graph and the things that we can also analyze. So that's going to be really interesting. That's going to be another experiment that I'm really looking forward to doing. So some of the changes in 4.0 that is kind of setting us up for being able to achieve these certain objectives in a future version, is one, we have a new object model, right? So in 3.x, we had projects, and then we had components, and then we had dependencies that kind of tied the two together. That is thrown out. That no longer exists. So in 4.0, every component is, by definition, a dependency of that project. So every component is now unique to the project, which means that all that metadata, the hashes, the license, everything else, the pedigree information, all of that information is now unique to that project, not a global thing like it was in 3.0. So that's going to allow us to do some of this pedigree and provenance type of analysis in the future. So that's going to be really great. Um, One of the things that we had to do, though, because we still have to answer the question of what's affected and where am I affected, we had to decouple component identity from that. So in order to ask the question of where am I affected, where is Apache Struts 2.0, we had to decouple component identity from the component itself, or kind of decouple it, so that we actually can make those types of queries, right? So that's also a change in 4.0, which also has some performance improvements as well. So that was a good change. Um, the second question, can deeper supply chain risk be identified? Some of the objectives that I would like to be able to meet in the 4.x series is really about project health and risk, right? This is the projects as defined in Dependency-Track. So what is the risk of those and what is the health of those? Open source project health and risk. Supplier, and this is, supplier could be kind of tied to open source, I guess, but I'm thinking more about commercial suppliers. If I have a commercial supplier, can I also do the health and risk of that supplier? So completely different sources of intelligence to be able to gather that, some of them not free. But in general, I think especially for the deeper forms of analysis, we're going to have to enrich the intelligence that we have today, and which is currently publicly available. So that's going to be kind of a grand experiment, and some realistically, I think it's going to come down to what can we realistically do as an open source project, and where do we have to rely on commercial vendors to be able to provide that enriched data to us, because there are some vendors that do this for a living and they do a very good job at it. So how can we reuse that information when it's possible? As an OWASP project, Dependency-Track is very agnostic, right? It supports multiple sources of free intelligence, but we also support commercial sources of intelligence as well. Currently, the only commercial source of intelligence is VulnDB from Risk-Based Security. We are going to be strengthening that integration in the future, and there are some plans to start integrating some other commercial things as well. So if you do use some commercial offerings, there is a possibility that the project will support it in the future. So if we want to meet these objectives, what changes were required in version 4.0 to be able to achieve these? Well, projects now have identity. So this is new. Before, in 3.x, projects basically just had a name and a version and a description and a few other bits of information, tags and whatnot. Projects now have complete identity. And this is kind of important because when you are, creating something, it could be an application, it could be another library, but when you're creating that thing also is very likely to be deployed somewhere or sold somewhere or distributed somewhere. Now you can actually, in 4.0, you can also have a complete identity for your project, which means that projects now have coordinates, so group name version. They also have package URLs, optionally. They also have SWID tag IDs. So if you are producing some commercial software, you can identify your project with a SWID tag ID, for example. Now, where this is beneficial is in two things. One, project health and risk. If we want to consume projects in the future as a dependency of some other project, which we can do, you have to kind of have identity in order to make that work. The second reason why we added identity is that CycloneDX 1.2 now includes the metadata portion of the BOM, which actually describes what it is that you are actually producing the BOM for. And the project identity is part of that. Some other things that are going to be required to meet some of these objectives is really mostly actually CycloneDX 1.2 support. We also added SPDX 2.2 support, but CycloneDX 1.2 support will give us some of these other things, or the data necessary to do some of these other things in the future. So yeah, CycloneDX 1.2 and SPDX 2.2 support are now included with Dependency-Track 4.0. The third question that we want to ask ourselves of Dependency-Track 4.x is, can policy be enforced on the supply chain? Some of the objectives here. One, we have to actually be able to create policies. Once we create policies, we need to be able to evaluate them. When we evaluate them, how do we enforce them locally within my team, within my organization? But how can we also enforce it more broadly across multiple suppliers in my supply chain? What does that look like? I don't know the answers to this. It's just one of the objectives. But in order to kind of set ourselves up to be able to do any of this, there were some changes that were required in Dependency-Track 4.0. So 4.0 now has a policy engine. You can configure your own policies. By default, or actually with 4.0, you have license policies, and you have allow and deny list component policies, and you can allow or deny based on a component's coordinates, their package URL, or their SWID tag ID. In the future, security violations will also be part of that, as well as some SBOM specific things, such as only being able to accept SBOMs which are signed or that have a valid signature or which come from a certain authority. These types of things, or produced by a certain tool. These types of things are going to be added to the policy engine in the future to be able to support SBOM specific use cases. But we had to have configurable policies in order to meet these objectives. We also had to, once we're evaluating policies, well, you kind of have to have violations. So policy violations are now part of 4.0. And when you have policy violations, you kind of have to need to audit them. So now there's an auditing workflow for triaging your violations, just as you currently triage your audit findings today for security. So that's all included in 4.0. And the fourth question we're trying to really answer in 4.x is how far can Dependency-Track scale? As I said earlier, there's organizations with over 1,000 or so projects in Dependency-Track, and these organizations are continuously submitting SBOMs to them to Dependency-Track on a daily basis. So it's inundated with SBOMs, possibly tens of thousands of SBOMs a day, which is great. But most organizations don't have 1,000 things. They have tens of thousands of things or more. So how can we kind of scale this out? How can we horizontally scale Dependency-Track to be able to do all these, more organizational wide type of things? Ideally, I'd love to see Dependency-Track reach over 100,000 projects, right? That should really be the goal. Some changes in 4.0 that's positioning it to make this happen. It's not going to make it happen by itself. There's going to be the other changes that will need to be done in order to meet these objectives. But one, decoupling the component identity from the components themselves was kind of required in order to horizontally scale, right? It's a necessity to be able to do the kinds of scaling that we need just to confine the amount of data that we have to process at any given time. So decoupling that component identity is, on the surface, it seems very not necessarily related, but it's going to be much more valuable in a future version. There's been a lot of performance improvements to Dependency-Track 4.0, especially around metrics. Metrics has always been one of these things where it takes an awful long time to analyze. Many performance improvements were done in this area. So I'm really hoping 4.0 doesn't have the kind of performance issues that 3.7, 3.8 had in terms of portfolio metrics. One of the big architectural changes that we made to 4.0 is really about the deployment model. In 3.8, it was possible. It wasn't the default, but in 4.0, it's actually going to be the default. We now have a separate API server and a separate front-end user interface, and both of these artifacts are deployed independently from one another. So the API server is essentially the back-end server. It's the entire Java stack that you know and that you deploy in Docker today. The front end has been decoupled from the Dependency-Track server, and now it is deployed independently of the Dependency-Track server. This allows us to do a couple different things. One, by separating it out, we are no longer tied to when we need to make changes to the UI, we can make those independently and release just an update to the front end without actually having to create a brand new Dependency-Track release, for one. On two, The decoupling is actually just part of, it's the very start of a continuous series of decouplings. Right now, the API server does that, right? It accepts requests in from its REST APIs, but then it also has this asynchronous processing thing that it does to analyze the bombs and make all the metric updates and all these other things that it does in the background asynchronously. Further on down the road, some of that is also going to be decoupled. So you'll have an API server, you'll have several different kinds of worker nodes, and you'll also have the front end. So we are not going down the microservices path. Microservices is not the correct architecture for dependency track. I'm not convinced of that. But we are going to be able to still horizontally scale to a point using a different but similar type of architecture. So some of the changes to 4.0 kind of set us up to be able to do that in the future. So what are some of the other new features that are being introduced, or changes being introduced in 4.0? Support for OpenID Connect. So lots of organizations, many enterprises use some kind of single sign-on service, either SAML or OIDC, OIDC being the newer of the two. So OIDC is supported in Dependency-Track 4.0. There is a ticket to add SAML support. I don't personally use SAML, but if anybody in the community wants to contribute SAML support, that would be greatly appreciated. Love to get SAML support in there as well. A new change for OSS index. So as many of you know, I have a multi, I have a complex relationship with the folks at Sonatype in many different levels. But one of the strategic things that we really had to work on between the dependency track project and the OSS index project from Sonatype is really about the integration. Most of the integrations for OSS index today are really about build time, right? I have a build and I'm going to use OSS index to analyze my artifacts. There's lots of tools that do that. Dependency track is not one of them. But there's lots of tools that do that. But all these tools are really about the build. Well, dependency track isn't about the build. It's about a portfolio of applications, possibly thousands of applications, each with their own builds, right? So lots and lots and lots of builds, which required an account. And it was kind of this chicken and egg thing where the majority, I would say, of questions in the Slack channel and GitHub tickets were really about, hey, I ingested a bomb, but dependency track is not finding any vulnerabilities. Well, did you enable OSS index? Oh, no, I didn't. I didn't realize I had to do that. So that was really a change that was kind of necessary just for the user experience for Dependency Track 3 for Dependency Track 4.0. So I'm really thankful that Dependency Track project and Sonatype were able to work together to be able to make this happen. One of the things that it was kind of on the roadmap anyway, but one of the things that Dependency Track project had to do in order to make this integration much more seamless for Dependency Track users was really about finding attributions, right? Today in Dependency Track 3.x, if you have a project and it has some SBOMs or components, you'll see the vulnerabilities, but you won't actually know what scanner, what analyzer actually is attributed at finding them. That's been corrected in Dependency-Track 4.0. So in 4.0, you'll see that, oh, this component has this vulnerability, and it was found by NPM, or it was found by the internal analyzer, or it was found by OSS index, or vulndb analyzer, right? So the analyzer is now part of the audit tab. And then you can also click on that. So when you click on just the finding attribution, it actually will take you to the URL of that vulnerable component in OSS index, or that vulnerable component in vulndb, or whatever. So or npm advisories. So that's now all part of the defining attributions. So that's a big change in 4.0. A change for performance metrics was really about how can we um, for inactive projects, it doesn't really make any sense to include these in portfolio metrics. It's the weights of CPU cycles. It leads to grossly inaccurate portfolio metrics. If a project is inactive, meaning that it's been retired, it's no longer in operation, it's no longer supported by your organization, it's inactive, but you might have to keep it for historical purposes. Well, now those inactive projects are now excluded from your portfolio metrics. So that's another change in 4.0. Oh, let's talk about the big one, migration. Notice I say migration, not upgrade. There will no automatic upgrades from 3.x to 4.0. The migration is complex. It's ongoing. Um, it is not a simple upgrade as it was between all the 3.x series, right? 3.1 to 3.2, 3.71 to 3.8. These are all very, very simple upgrades. The migration from 3.8 to 4.0 is going to be much more in-depth. And we wanted the migration to be more interactive. We didn't want to just start up a server and let it magically do things, because there's a high probability that, especially when the migration is first released, that we may not get it right. And um, so we wanted the migration to be more interactive, so you could actually see what maybe didn't go correct during that migration. Obviously, backups highly recommended. Um, but it also means that we can quickly fix and release new versions of that migration utility completely independent of Dependency-Track. So that is a complete independent project without any coupling or requires of 4.0. So once we actually have something in place, obviously Slack and Twitter notifications will be a thing, but that is the repo URL of where it will be when it's done. And really, the idea is there. I think the Dependency-Track project is going to get most of this in place, but I think the community feedback in making it better is going to go a long way. 3.0 to, if you were an organization, for example, that did 3.0 to 3.8 and did all of those different upgrades, your database, the way it looks today, is going to look a little bit different than somebody who just did 3.8, right? So there's going to be historical things, and because you ran 3.0, that a 3.8 database is not going to have. So in order to accommodate the hundreds of different variants of what a database could look like, we're really going to rely on the community for feedback and to submit pull requests to make the migration utility better. Which means that 4.0 will be available before the migration is actually complete. I know it's not ideal for existing Dependency-Track adopters, but we really want to get 4.0 in the hands of more people as soon as possible. We really want them to start benefiting from 4.0 and what we're going to be doing for 4.1 and 4.2 sooner, rather than having to have them deploy for 3.8 and then start migrating. We want to get 4.0 to as many hands as quickly as possible, and then worry about the migration and really start concentrating on getting that migration right. So that's going to be an ongoing process. There is a Dependency-Track beta channel. We've got a couple people in the community that are working on the migration, so it is in progress. I'll say that. So who's up for a demo? Let's see what Dependency-Track 4.0 actually looks like. Okay, so let's go over here. All right, so the dashboard kind of looks the same at first glance until you realize that, oh, there's this new widget called policy violations. And then I also have the percentage of violations that I've actually audited. You'll also notice that dependencies are now gone. Dependencies are no more. Um, but let's go ahead and create a project. And looks like I already have a few created already. But let's go ahead and create a new project. And you'll see that the component or the projects now have identity. So not only does it have a name, version, and oh, classifier was added because CycloneDX. So this is the same classifier that's used for components when you define them. So if I wanted to create a new project, I don't know, say um, Acme Intranet 2.5. This is going to be an application. I can add description. Let's not do Java. Let's do npm JS. Okay, so those are my tags. But I can also give it an identity. And maybe this is com.acme. I could give it a package URL. I could give it a CPE if this is going to be like a commercial piece of software. Nor I can also give it a SWID tag ID. So these are all things that you can do today. You cannot generate the SWID tag IDs. I'm really waiting for the NVD to announce some of their roadmap items for SWID. I think there might be a possibility in a future version of Dependency-Track to be able to, from Dependency-Track, be able to tell the NVD what my SWID tag ID is for the thing that I'm actually building. So that might be a thing, but it depends on which APIs the NVD ultimately releases and supports. And right now they were expected to release a roadmap earlier this year. It never happened. People are still waiting for that. But I think there's some possibility of future integrations with the SWID tag IDs with Dependency-Track. We'll just have to see how that plays out. So anyway, that's how you would create a project. Let's go into an existing project, however. Let's go into the Visual Studio. Oops. Let's go into Visual Studio Code. No, I don't know what version this is. I just randomly picked some data here. But you'll notice that I no longer have a dependencies tab. It's now components. So I've got 1,370 components in there. And then clicking on one of these will actually take me to the component. So it's a little bit different view. Related. A little bit different view, but you'll notice that the breadcrumbs are also there as well. So you'll notice that I'm in the Visual Studio Code project, and I'm looking at this component version of this project. So again, my global component model doesn't exist anymore. So it's been replaced with this project-centric model. Okay, so I can also look at the vulnerabilities for this particular component. Let's go back to the overview. You'll also notice that I've got policy violations and the type of policy violation. 4.0 includes support for license risk and operational risk. Operational risk being, I think it's, I don't know if age is part of that yet or not. It might be on the backlog, but operational risk does include allowed and denied components by their coordinates by CPE, Perl, or SWID tag IDs. license risk is exactly that. Um, let's go back to my project. The audit vulnerabilities, really nothing much has changed here, except for visually on the left-hand side here. This is actually how you expand and contract each row. So in previous versions, you would actually click on the row and it would actually expand or contract. That has been replaced by the arrows on the left-hand side. So this is how you expand and contract now. Um, this link actually takes you to the vulnerability on as it exists in Dependency-Track, which is existing behavior. But now this new behavior is really about finding attribution. So in this particular case, the NPM audit analyzer in Dependency-Track was responsible for finding this vulnerability. And clicking on that will actually take you to the advisory on NPM. Likewise, clicking on this will actually take you to the advisory on OSS index for this particular component. Now, I don't have an account. I don't have my Dependency-Track instance set up with an OSS index account. It was able to find all these vulnerabilities using anonymous OSS index integration. So straight out of the box, OSS index will work. One of the reasons why you might want to have an OSS index account, however, is when you do click on this link, if you have an account, you'll see more in-depth information. So not just the information that's on the screen here, but you'll see other things as well. But it's not required for Dependency-Track. So that was a special concession agreement for Dependency-Track users. But a new tab is policy violations. So let's take a look at that actually. I don't know if I have any. Oh, I can add one. Let's go ahead and take a look at that in a moment. Now, on previous versions of Dependency-Track, with the global model, you had projects and components. Well, components has been essentially replaced with a searching ability. Looking at the hundreds of thousands of components or more that could exist in Dependency-Track isn't very useful. Most of the time, you want to find out where a component is used, right, and who uses it. So that's what the components search is really all about. So you can search by its coordinates, so group name version. You can also search by the package URL, CPE, SWID tag ID, or you can even search by the hash value. So if you know, for example, a component, possibly by a few different names, is malicious in nature, you can actually search for that hash across all of your applications in your portfolio that you're actually tracking. This is one of the benefits of separating out component identity and all that from the object model. I don't know if, let's see, I'll just do like a, I think this should work. Yeah, so that's everything that has a group of Apache, for example. And I can narrow this down. For example, maybe I'm looking for something, one of the HTTP components. So HTTP core. Okay, maybe I want to search for HTTP core because that might have a vulnerability in it. So that's how you would do that. So you can see right here that it's actually used by the Keycloak project. If there was multiple findings, you would see all of the various projects in my organization that actually use that component. So a little bit different view than previous versions of Dependency-Track, but I think it's asking the right questions, right? Because most organizations, I think, especially when a brand new vulnerability comes out that has a nice shiny logo and whatnot, you want to know where in your organization that component is being used. And I think this view actually does a better job at it than the previous view in Dependency-Track. The vulnerabilities, I don't think anything has really changed at all in this view at all. It's all pretty much the same. The licenses, I think, are also the same. I don't think anything has changed in here from Dependency-Track 3. However, what is new is policy management. So this is a brand new, screen in Dependency-Track. Out of the box, Dependency-Track ships with 4 different license groups. There's a copyleft, a non-commercial, a permissive, and a weak copyleft group. Now, these are the defaults. You are able to make modifications to these whenever you want, but this is what Dependency-Track ships with. It also is not comprehensive. There are thousands and thousands of open source licenses. I think the SPDX project defines 450, maybe 500 licenses, something along those lines. Not all of those licenses have been, analyzed. This is actually using public sources of um, of knowledge. So the Dependency-Track project did not do this work ourselves. We actually relied on multiple public sources to be able to tell us which of these licenses actually falls in which of these groups. But because we were using public sources for all this stuff, it was kind of limited to the licenses that were analyzed. So not all SPDX license IDs were analyzed as part of this project. In fact, there's probably, I'd have to guess, but there's probably less than 30 or 40 that are analyzed. So there's a large number of SPDX license IDs that are not in any of the license groups. But as an organization, you can actually go through that and make modifications and changes. And if you have a legal team and they maybe already have a lot of this information, great, you can actually use that. And you can create your own license groups, and you can put licenses in those groups. You can add licenses too. For example, if you want to add an additional license to the copyleft, you can just select it from the list here. So it's very easy to modify these license groups that we give you. You can also delete them license groups. So if you want to do something completely different with the license groups, you can do that as well. And then you can create policies. So maybe I want to create a policy called, I don't know, no struts. Or maybe the policy will be, let's see, let's call it prohibited components. Okay, so we'll create a list called prohibited components, and then we will create some conditions for this policy. So we're going to say that if this, if it has coordinates that match, I don't know, Apache struts is, I'm sure it's probably org.apache something, right? And it probably has its own thing here as well, doesn't it? You can kind of do that. I think that's the syntax for this. So it will match anything with the group org.apache.struts. So any component, struts core, struts whatever, all of that would be part of this this condition. And if you want to fail in that condition, that is what you do. So it's really easy to create policies. And you can also create other things. So if you want to create it by SWID tag ID, or if you want to do it by license group, for example, is copyleft. Maybe I don't want any copyleft licenses in my organization. Then you can add that as well. Question from the chat: when will the video be available? Absolutely, that's my plan. So yeah, so license group is part of the license conditions today. But you can also do some other things. So CPEs, for example, you can, for example, maybe, I don't know what the CPE is for Apache struts, but maybe it's CPE. I can't remember the syntax of it. I'm just guessing here. Actually, I think I can just do struts, I think. It's just going to match a CPE that contains struts. So you can do that as well. In the future, we were talking about some of the things that we were looking forward to with 4.0, right, or 4.x series. Some of the things that I would like to add to the policy evaluation is things like, is the bomb signed? Is it is the signature valid or not? Is it from uh, a particular supplier, or does it contain a component from a particular supplier, independent of coordinates and all that? I want to know who I got it from, because that's also important. Um, so it's that kind of information that I would love to be able to eventually put into the policy conditions to be evaluated in a future version of Dependency-Track. So let's go ahead and just add this, I guess. Oh, actually, this is already added. So let's come back here, and I am just going to add, oops, I'm going to add, I got this sample project here. Let's just go ahead and add manually. We're going to add a component manually just to see if we can get this to work. And I know all this data is garbage. It's not actually accurate. I'm not going for accuracy right now. Okay, I just want to see. Oh, there's my policy violation. That's the sole purpose of me manually doing that, is just to show you an example of a policy violation. So in this case, it is a prohibited component. So it failed the prohibited components policy. Um, so very much like the auditing framework, now I can look at all the violations and make audit decisions based on the violations. So in this case, I see the condition in which it was violated. I see that it was violated not based on its license or anything like that, but based on its coordinates. It matched up the org Apache struts, any name, any component name, any version. It matched up based on the coordinates, and that's why it failed the policy evaluation. So based on this, again, you can, just like the other auditing workflows, you can go in there, make comments, make audit decisions, just like you can in vulnerabilities. The only difference is that the analysis is different, right? In this case, it's either approved or rejected um, in terms of policy decisions, right? It's for vulnerabilities. I think we had like false positives and exploitable and not applicable, those types of analysis decisions. For policy violations, you either accept it or you reject it. And when you approve, then you can optionally suppress that violation. And then when you suppress the violation, it should magically disappear. So if I do a refresh of this, for example, um, well, it should magically disappear. Looks like I have a little bit of work to do. But when you suppress the violations, your counts and everything else are going to be, you know, account for that, right? So your risk scores will go down and that sort of thing. So that's your violations. Let's go to administration. There was a few changes made to the administration. Not a lot, but for organizations that want to do single sign-on with OpenID Connect. With OIDC, you have now OIDC users and you have OIDC groups. So these are two unique things in the admin UI. We have dedicated instructions in the on the documentation site that will be published shortly. There's a question in the chat that's considering the folks who define policies are probably different from those auditing failures. Wouldn't it be useful to add something like descriptions, justifications to policies? Yeah, absolutely. That's really what the comment trail is for. But if you'd like to see something different than that, please create a ticket on GitHub and let me know exactly what you'd like to see. Um, One of the things that I would like to, I think it's part of this actually, is yeah. So to the point where the people who are creating the policies are different from the people auditing the policies. Policy management is its own permission now. So you can actually, for example, if you wanted to give the legal team rights to do policy management, or maybe your security, some person on your risk team to do the policy management, you can absolutely do that without actually having to give them full admin access to everything. So policy management is its own permission. Policy violation is also its own permission. So that was kind of broken apart. So permissions, you can't actually manage policies, or you can't actually see what those violations were. Okay, so that's really, I think, all of the major changes to the interface. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit before we go for the rest of the day. I would like to talk for just a couple of minutes about the deployment models. So we mentioned that the deployment model was going to be changing from a central server, right, that has the server-side functionality as well as the user interface in a single bundle to more of a separate deployment option. Um, so I'd like to show you that real quick. Let's go to hub.docker.com. I don't think I'm logged in. No, I'm not, of course, because I'm using a different browser. Is it R? I can't remember. R. Oh, it's U. Okay. So in previous versions of Dependency-Track, we were publishing to the OWASP organization. So Dependency-Track 3.0 to 3.8 was published to OWASP, and there's a number of where's Dependency-Track? Yeah, I think we are close to like nearing 800,000 Docker pulls at this point. So there's a lot of Docker pulls at this point. But starting with 4.0, we're going to actually be transitioning this to our own GitHub organization. It's not going to be insanely beneficial up front, but as we start decoupling things and making various types of workers, for example, to meet some of our scaling requirements, we're going to have a lot more repositories. So it kind of made sense to have our own organization instead of relying on the OWASP org and all the other non-related projects in that org. So right now there are 3 repositories in Docker Hub. There's a bundled, which is the bundled now is what we have today, right? We have 3.8 in previous is the bundled. It is the server, it is the front end, all in a single Docker container. So that is one of the deployment options, and it is going to be deprecated, right? So there's a lot of organizations obviously using this approach, but it's going to be it is deprecated, but this deployment will be supported throughout the longevity of 4.0. So as long as we possibly can support this option, we're going to support it because this is what the majority of organizations do today. But the bundle is essentially this API server and this front end together. So this API server is running the embedded Jetty container, right, with all the backend server functionality. The front end is running Nginx and contains the Vue.js application. They are deployed independently, and there are instructions on how to set it all up. We also have a Docker Compose file that you can just copy and paste and fire up, and it just magically works. So that's also an option, and that, quite honestly, I think that option is probably what's going to be documented on the Dependency-Track website. Let's see. There's a couple questions in the so that's the Docker repos. Lots of changes there. I think as we start creating different types of workers, there might be a metrics worker, for example, and you might want to have a couple of those. So that might be its own Docker repo. We might have I, we haven't decided yet, but we might have another one that does just the outdated component analysis, looking at all the various repos and determining which components are out of date. That might be its own project in Docker Hub. There might be a few others as well, especially for SBOM consumption and processing versus vulnerability and risk identification. So those will probably be different types of worker nodes, I would imagine. Again, not microservices, just individual types of workers that you can scale up depending on how what your load is like, and what a lot of this actually depends on what ecosystems you're actually using as well. So it varies by organization. There's a question in the chat about CPU and memory requirements. It hasn't changed really. The memory requirements is still, I think we have it at, I run my production at 8 gigabytes. I think it's recommended to go up to 16. That's for pretty large Dependency-Track installations, I guess. But some of the performance improvements in 4.0 should help remediate some of the memory concerns surrounding 3.8 in previous, especially 3.7 and 3.8. I think were pretty bad with memory consumption. So 4.0 should be a little bit better, although I haven't actually measured it. Theoretically, it should be better though. CPUs are still a thing. Again, Dependency-Track does a lot of asynchronous processing. So the more SBOMs you're throwing at it, the more components you have in your portfolio, the more it has to process in the background. And the more processing it has to do in the background, the more CPUs you kind of need in order to be able to do that processing and get results in any kind of respectable time period. So 2 CPUs is still the minimum, but honestly, I run mine with 8. So anything above 4 should be fine for most cases. You can still tweak all this stuff as well, though. You can still specify the number of threads and worker processes and all that you could in previous versions of Dependency-Track. Been using it in a pod with 1.5 gigabytes of RAM. Yeah, that's not going to work. The docs for the Docker container actually state that you need 4.5 gigabytes of RAM. And it's actually supposed to fail if you don't. So I'm not sure why it's not failing if you don't have that. But yeah, 4.5 gig is the minimum for Dependency-Track server. As we start breaking some of this stuff apart, though, as the API server itself starts to be, decoupled into various types of workers, I think what you'll see is that the API server will then just suddenly drop the amount of memory that's required for that. But then we're going to have different types of workers, and each one of those, might have a gig or two requirements, right? So your memory consumption is not going to be all in this one big basket that exists today with the bundled or API server. In the future, it will be distributed more evenly among the various types of workers. So right now, because all of the processing is asynchronous based on different types of events, it shouldn't be architecturally that complicated to create workers from all this event-driven architecture that we currently have in place. So yeah, expect the memory to go from a lot in this one big container to more distributed in smaller containers. So with that, that is about all I wanted to show you today. I'm really trying to get 4.0 released before the end of the year. So that is really my goal. 4.0 is stable. It's been stable for the last month or so. The Docker containers have just recently been decoupled to what you see here today. So that's more of a recent change. But Dependency-Track 4 is pretty much ready to go. It's I'm actually using it semi-production where I'm at now, and it's working just fine. It needs a little bit more testing, and over the holiday weekend, I plan to do that and try to get 4.0 released before January 1st. That's been my goal. Actually, I wanted to get it originally in November, but that didn't work. But before the end of the year, I think is a realistic thing. The migration, I would expect realistically 30 to 60 days after. So 30 to 60 days after Dependency-Track 4.0 is released, I would expect the migration to be publicly available. Obviously, the more community feedback we get, the more contributions we get from the community, the faster we can expedite that. And obviously, the more involvement we get from the community, the higher quality migration will actually end up being at the end of the day. So really going to be counting on the community to kind of help us with that migration. The last thing I wanted to cover is kind of the support, I guess. With Dependency-Track 4.0, we are actually changing we're going to target a monthly release cadence. So in 3.x, we were releasing every couple of months, right? Every couple of months was a release until we got to 3.8. Now 3.8 was released, I think, in March, and it's December now. It's almost the end of the year. So that is a tremendously long time to wait for a release, especially given that there are known defects that people are having to kind of deal with in 3.8. So 4.0 has been a long time in the making, but it is the goal of the project. It's my personal goal to release updates every single month. So roughly every 30 days, there should be like 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, etc. So that's really going to be the goal with 4.x, is trying to get smaller releases available to the community, but more often. But that also might impact how your organization actually deploys Dependency-Track. You might actually be in a situation where you have to upgrade more often than not. So so just note that we're trying to go to that monthly release cadence. I'd love to be able to do something sooner. I just don't think it's realistic. But monthly releases is really going to be the target. Question in the I understand what you meant by migration. Migration meaning you cannot upgrade. The data model is different. Dependencies no longer exist. Table structures are different. You cannot necessarily do an upgrade. So it will be a migration, meaning that it will be a standalone utility that you'll have to execute in order to get the tables in a format, in a structure that is acceptable to 4.0. Now that's a lot of manipulation, and it's probably going to involve some temporary tables, some temporary storage space. It also relies on some logic. It's not just SQL statements. So that's what we mean by migration. It's not just being able to start up Dependency-Track like you've done before and just have it magically upgrade. It will be a migration. We're trying to make it an in-place migration, so essentially an upgrade. But there is a possibility that we may not be able to do that. We might actually have to migrate from one database to another database, possibly on the same server, obviously, but it will be a migration nonetheless. So anyway, that's the migration. Yeah, and that's yeah, it was stated in the comments. It's not. Yeah, the data models are just not compatible. So yep, very good. Well, thank you everyone for attending. This is hopefully this has been useful for you. I think for such a big release, I think this live stream was hopefully helpful to the community. I'm going to try to publish this video on our YouTube channel is later today, hopefully. So thanks everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.